Welcome to This Week in Common Sense, starring Paul Jacob. My name is Timothy Virkola, and on this podcast, we are going to be covering the big stories that have appeared this week. This last week, well, today's March 19th, 2021, so you can see which week it is, and we'll be talking about the big stories that have appeared this week on thisiscommonsense.org. You started off with the Dystopia de la Brazil. And that's your title, and it's really quite good, though I don't know exactly what it means.
De la means of the, and since Brazil, is actually it's Portuguese speaking, so I'm not even right there. But there's somebody somewhere in Brazil who's speaking Spanish, and so I wanted to use that. But of course, we're not talking about the country Brazil. We're talking about Donna Brazil. Who's an interesting character in some ways, manages to stay on TV even though it seems like she's broken every journalistic rule. But of course, she's the former Democratic National Committee chair. So this is a very high up Democrat. And of course, she was getting paid something, I believe, as a contributor to CNN years ago. And it came out that she basically was giving Hillary Clinton advance word of the questions, which seems to me to not be journalistically the right thing to do.
But they never had much repercussions for that.
As I recall, and I could be wrong, so I don't have a distinct memory, but it seemed to me that she wasn't out the door immediately at CNN, which she should have been. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but
Fox picked her up.
But yeah, my sense was that it was a little bit before CNN booted her. And then Fox picked her up, and I think that's, but they wanted a high profile Dem who they could feature and stuff. But yeah, it's really sad. And the reason I mention her is because she was on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace, and her comment after, they started to discuss Joe Biden, President Biden. And the first comment was Jonathan Swain from Axios, who basically said, the fact that he hasn't had a press conference, full-fledged press conference in all this time, the modern record by a considerable margin now and growing day by day, that who should be surprised because he hid during the whole campaign. I mean, we just had a presidential campaign. There wasn't much of a campaign, interestingly enough. And that hasn't been discussed a whole lot. I mean, we all know the reason why it wasn't much of a campaign. But, we know the reason for a lot of things. We talk about it all the time. It's interesting that there wasn't much of a campaign. What news there was actively, hidden and downplayed and deplatformed and censored and so on. But such is life. Anyway, so he makes that point, which is a valid point, that of course Biden doesn't feel the need to do a press conference. He didn't feel the need to campaign. And in fact, kind of felt the need not to. Or at least his advisors did, I think. And then they were right. So then Karl Rove, maybe misconstruing exactly what Chris Wallace meant, says, well, look, he's just not up to it. He's 78 years old, and he's not going to look good in a press conference. And he's not. That's something, that's something else. That's we had all the talk about the 25th Amendment, which I have to say, I never gave a second thought before Trump becomes president, and it gets talked about all the time. And but you could see it in play, and it's hard to know. People who are not in early stages of dementia, certainly forget things from time to time, or they slip up. And there's been a lot made of the fact that as a kid he stuttered, and so maybe some of his things are telltale signs of that. Which of course, it doesn't seem to explain the totality of it at all. And so it doesn't answer anything, even if that is part of it. But it almost seems like that's not really part of it. That's kind of like just smoke. But anyway, it's what I find interesting is that we can have. Well, I find it interesting that the world's superpower, and I hate that term, and I don't think it's an accurate term because there's no superpower that we have beyond anybody else. And most of the space and other things that maybe we had some super ability that others didn't have, we kind of handed away. Which even from kind of a nationalistic standpoint, which I used to look at most of the people who were in Washington as nationalists, and now that's a dirty word because Trump happened to be a super nationalist. But I think in some of the ways he was a super nationalist, and I don't mean that in some crazy way, just very strongly pro this country. And frankly, I'm into all kinds of international things. I consider myself a citizen of the world. I also consider myself a citizen of America. And I would not trade the citizenship as a United States citizen for citizen of the world, because I think I have real protection here. And trust me, I've been arrested by the feds and put in the hoosegow before. So I have no illusions about how much protection there is here. But I think I have very real, noticeable, clear, obvious advantages and protections in the United States of America that I would not have as a citizen of the world, because there's nobody to protect those rights other than maybe the UN. And I rest my case. But anyway, I went on a little tangent there. But it's interesting that we've had a president that our own media certainly mocked, who was certainly mockable in all kinds of ways, Mr. Trump, who was disliked by a majority of the country, just disliked less than they disliked Hillary Clinton. And just we had this kind of ripping apart for 4 years. And then we get a president who was, in essence, I never seen, and we discussed this in previous podcasts, Tim, as you'll recall, never saw the Democrats circle the wagon so quickly. It seemed like in a weekend before Super Tuesday. I remember because I was in New Orleans for the pandemic hit, kind of. And in literally a couple of days, every Democratic candidate was out and endorsing Biden, except the one candidate who should have gotten out, who had to have polling telling her, you're about to get clobbered in your home state, not first, not second, but third place in your home state. You're in deep trouble. And, she Elizabeth Warren is the one who stays in. That's when I said, "Oh my goodness, I've never seen that many candidates get out that quickly and endorse the front runner. I've just never seen it." And I didn't do some analysis or study or whatever, but I'm an old guy now, and in all the time, I just don't ever remember it happening that fast and that completely. And then the caveat being, Warren doesn't. The one person who by getting out would have really created a boost, because Sanders and Warren were vying for that same constituency so much, wow, something else. So anyway, this guy is anointed, but he's not, the truth is he's a Trumpian character in a lot of ways. He has a tendency to say what sounds good at the moment. And Trump does this as kind of like a carnival barker salesman who everything's terrific and yes, and we'll have that in the next week. And then, 6 years later, they still don't have it. Is that a lie? Well, it depends on your intent, and maybe it just didn't quite happen. But and Biden's that same way. I remember the video, which you can find on YouTube, where he's at some event in New Hampshire, and he's campaigning for president. This is like the 80s, I think, or maybe it's the early 90s. And he gets in a fight with someone and is telling him how I'm smarter than you are and my IQ's higher and I graduated at the top of my class and I got this scholarship. And it turns out, and I'm thinking as I'm watching it, not knowing what exactly, Biden's history is, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, what a rude jerk who's in somebody else's house lecturing some person about who he doesn't know about how much smarter he is than them. I mean, that's just sickening. And then it turns out everything he said was a lie. He said three things and it turned out all three were false. He lied. And then, of course, later he apologized because he misspoke. So anyway, this is Biden. He becomes president, and it's pretty clear that we now have installed somebody. And I say we've installed in all these different ways. Yes, he's now installed as president, and we're not really sure he's all there. And I don't want to say that cavalierly. This is getting older. It's serious stuff. So many of us have dealt with parents who have Alzheimer's, with dementia that's not Alzheimer's. It happens, and it's heartbreaking. But it's and look, I'm not a doctor. I don't play one in podcasts. I don't know exactly what's going on, but I know two things. I know that his behavior is not confidence building. And I also know that the National Press Corps can't be trusted to tell me the truth about it. So that's really problematic. But anyway, no need, I say all of that to get to this point, no need to worry your pretty little heads about it. Because as Donna Brazile tells us, it's all about when will the check arrive. As long as Biden sends the money, all is good. And weeks ago, I had a commentary where I talked about twice in the Washington Post, once in a column and once just in a news article. They were pretty much saying it'd be smart for Democrats to send this money to people. And of course, I point out at the website, this is commonsense.org, Dystopia de la Brazil. Monday, the 15th of March, that was the commentary. And I point out there in a footnote that, of course, let's not pretend that this is the Democrats buying votes, those darn Democrats, because, Republicans, when they cast votes for some of these stimulus things, and they have done it, TARP, they did it with the stimulus last year. And they're doing the same thing. One of the reasons Republicans a lot of times have talked about cutting spending. They don't do it. Democrats don't even talk about it. I don't know which one's better or worse. It seems like they're the same in what comes out. And if they get to be one party in control, they're the same squared, and then it's really bad. But Republicans or Democrats, every individual entrepreneurial politician who's in Congress knows, unless they're really idiots, and then even instinctively you'd think they'd know, their power is tied to how much money they control and they spend. That's what their power is tied to. And they know people come to talk to them about stuff, and they know what that stuff is, and that stuff is about money. I once asked a state legislator in Minnesota when we were lobbying there beginning of this century for initiative and referendum rights. And he was a supporter, he's one of the few Democrats. And I asked him, how many people make the trip? He was from an hour, maybe even 2 hours outside of Minneapolis, St. Paul, the capital. And how many people have come to St. Paul to meet with you that it wasn't about money, that it wasn't about a program where they benefited, they're the school chief and it's about the school budget, or they're a company that needs this new thing in the state, some regulation or whatever. And he told me, I think, it's pretty rare that anybody comes up here. And I said, well, that it wasn't about money. And then it was like, I don't think anybody has ever made that trip. And so, Donna Brazil's not dumb. This isn't, oh, what a silly thing she said. But I think the American people need to know that the smart people in Washington, again and again and now again, believe we can be bought. And we can't be bought. Not all of us. There's enough of us who will not be bought. I look back so often because I'm big for democracy and initiative and referendum, let the voters decide. And of course, I don't want the voters democratically deciding anything that's not their business. If it's about somebody's personal individual right, I don't care if you got 99.9% of the vote. It doesn't matter. You don't have any right to decide it. But anything government has the right to decide, I figure deciding it democratically is the way to go. And I find that the people are much better in their democratic decisions than their so-called representatives are. And I think about, you think about Obamacare, which is a huge new spending spree for healthcare. And healthcare being a huge issue and concerns a lot of people and concerns them not just ideologically, but in their real lives. So you got people who aren't political who say, hey, I want this or I want that. And yet Obamacare passed with the majority of the public against it. When George Bush brought his, what was it, Medicare D or whatever it is, but it was the, we're going to help pay for your prescriptions and so on. It was not popular. Now, this is the federal government saying we're going to give you a bunch of goodies. And there are a lot more people getting the goodies than are paying the heavier taxes income-wise. And that's where most people, I think, are looking at it. Probably not a full, complete picture of it. Because I always hate it when wealthy people say, well, the poor don't pay any taxes. It just makes me so mad because, of course, they pay all kinds of taxes. It's just that most of them are better hidden than the income tax. I mean, every time they get a gallon of gas, they're paying taxes. Every time they turn around, they're paying taxes.
They're also getting stuck with a lot of things that other people don't notice. If you don't have much money, that traffic ticket is going to really do you a lot of damage. There are many people in America.
Yes, and here in Virginia, where I live, just 25 miles south of D.C., safely outside the Beltway, not safely enough, but years ago, the legislature pretty overwhelmingly, bipartisanly passed these abusive driver fees, which, of course, when the public saw what they were just abusive fees. But it was legislation that allowed them, if they did some kicker on it and said, oh, this was aggressive driving or abusive driving, they could take that $140 ticket or $200 ticket or $98 ticket and make it $900 or $1,400 or $2,200. And you can see how for some people that would really be a serious problem. And for some people, it would be a heck of an irritant. But for most people, it's like you're wiping them out. You're wiping them out. And people get so mad in the traffic here and people darting in and out of, the traffic that I kind of thought, well, people are going to go, we got to do something. No. And Virginia has no initiative, no referendum to speak of. A few cities have a tiny process that you can do about 3 things in. It's really sad. But a guy put a petition online, and this is the power of petitioning that isn't tied 100% to I'm going to change the law, although I like it when it changes the law a whole lot more. But anyway, it can be powerful even when it doesn't, because in this case, it did. I believe, I was right as it was hitting 75,000 signatures. And I believe it got to 175,000 or some odd signatures on this online petition saying, take these fees off. It so caught fire that the sponsor of the bill apologized. They demanded a session to go back and rip it up and stomp on it and say they'll never do it again. I forget what led me on that tremendous tangent point, but it's an interesting story.
That was me. I shouldn't have gone there because it's kind of the opposite of the main theme of this particular common sense piece, which, by the way, the image online is a quote from Juvenal, the Roman satirist. Give them bread and circuses, and they will never revolt. That's, of course, an overstatement. That's what satire is. But nevertheless, there is a principle, and it is unfortunate that our leaders do have that principle in mind when they go about doing their business.
And the number one problem, like even when we've in 2008, as bad things were happening in the economy and so on, there is an urgency to politics, and so things can get done sometimes in those situations. I think one of the things that hurts on reform is that life is so good. People have money, they have entertainment, that it's life is good. And so if you want to tune out bad news, you can. If and I do think that there's, our elected officials have benefited from their ability to send checks. It makes people like them more than they would like them otherwise. But I also think we still have enough, and it's not just a remnant, it's a whole bunch of people in this country who work hard, who want to have a good life, who are awake, alert, smart, and know there ain't no free lunch shipping money into my bank account when I don't really need that money. I'm not out of work. I'm not. It's stupid. It's stupid, and it's, what does it say when people do that? It either says they're really rich, and we know the government isn't really rich because they don't have any money except for ours. So it's like it says that the hubris is thick, and it really is scary. I we'll get to a commentary about Taiwan and therefore China and so on later. But I was talking to someone this week. It may have been you, Tim. I can't remember who it was, but about China and the United States. And someone was saying that China has is leveraged in some different ways. Their demography, the fact that they have all these people who are older and they haven't had as many kids because of their stupid, evil, vicious one-child policy, which is now a stupid, evil, vicious two-child policy. But in many ways, China could have all kinds of economic trouble ahead. They're not immune to overspending and overborrowing and those things either. And they have a very opaque society, so there's not the same checks and balances. But of course, what are we always bitching and moaning about on this podcast? And at thisiscommonsense.org with a commentary Monday through Friday, we're moaning and bemoaning the fact that we don't have much control. We aren't able to better hold our government to account. And our government's, we've spent trillions for what? I mean, this COVID relief, this is serious stuff. And 500,000 people have died and so on. And 30%, no one seems to have any pushback to the fact that this $1.9 trillion spending, only 30% was for COVID. And they used this to, shore up a bunch of pension plans where politicians promise stuff and never put the money away, which should be a criminal offense. But for some reason, they let them get away with it. If you're in private enterprise and you try that, you will go to jail. It's just so wrong what continues to happen. And nobody's for that. I mean, think of the friends, relatives, acquaintances who are on the other side on political things, None of them are for doing that kind of stuff in a bill. Why do they do it? Well, because they need to buy votes and they want to send money to their. Well, why do you think big business or big labor always supports one side? Because they pay them. That's how it works. So and I think in essence, the media has sort of bought into that. They've bought into it in looking at the American voter as usually a moron who they don't particularly like, who they don't think they can fully inform because that moron might not vote, the way they think they should, and who looks at politicians as flawed people, but if they're on their side, that's the best that can happen. And since the people aren't embracing big government socialism with the kind of, love and adoration that they should, it's obviously the people's fault. So that's our first script. And if you'll just give us the next 6 hours, we'll get through them all.
Well, as you were talking about how the Democratic insiders got Biden in office, I was reminded that on Wednesday you talked about the same thing. But in this case, with something you just talked about a moment ago, which is about an activist who is not on our side. She's
Yes.
Sarah Silverman, the actress and comedian. She's a progressive, and she's not generally on our side at all. But she complained about the Democratic Party this last week. And interestingly, she didn't complain about the thing that I thought she would complain about, which she mentioned is the how they treated her favorite candidate. Twice she supported the runs of Bernie Sanders, and twice the Democratic Party insiders really messed him up. They worked hard and mightily to make sure he didn't get in office.
We raised at Common Sense, this is commonsense.org, one of the earliest people to raise the issue of superdelegates. You're going into this contest, and it's like the media hadn't told anybody any of the rules. And the Democrats had kind of gone to this worst ever, like all these superdelegates, to where now Bernie Sanders did not win a majority of the delegates from the votes and so on. But he could have and still have lost because of all the super delegates, the insiders. And that's what it all is, governors and other politicians and other party officials. And it's like, look, if you're such a big shot, put your name on the ballot. And in other words, you'd think the Democratic Party would be Democratic. But what they did to Sanders, and I know quite a few Democrats, liberals, progressives, socialists, who are very well aware of what the Democratic Party has done to Sanders, and has a view of the Democratic Party that is incredibly mirror similar to the view that Republicans have, who do not call themselves Republicans, call themselves conservatives, or call themselves constitutional conservatives, but tend to vote for the Republicans almost all the time when they can stomach it. In the same way that I think a lot of, I know so many people who voted for Jill Stein or voted for the Libertarian candidate who are on the left in 2016, who could not vote for Donald Trump and could not vote for Hillary Clinton. So there is, it has shrunk, but there are people on the left. And the nice thing about Sarah Silverman coming out is her coming out on the cancel culture and on, being fascist progressives, fascist commies, just having this kind of cultural revolution in China, which was, a lot more about killing people and revolution and not that much about culture. But anyway, it is powerful to see that because it's important. Everything's so partisan. The more somebody like her steps up, the better.
she is basically calling out her side because she is very much a progressive. She doesn't even like the word Democratic, apparently, because she thinks the party she was voting for all these years was the Progressive Party, as you mentioned. And that's kind of funny. But she really is also calling them out. And it's not just the Democratic insiders. She's calling her people out for being Puritan scolds and kind of nasty
Kind of
people.
the same thing that good old Jerry Seinfeld. Uh, I put a T in that, but Seinfeld had talked about years ago, which is that comedy's not going to be funny anymore. If you know, if and I think part of her getting it on free speech is the fact that she has said some things that are incredibly offensive. And I think you could find them funny and still find them incredibly offensive. And
Well, they are funny. I mean, her rape jokes are the best rape jokes ever made.
right,
They're
but
hilarious. But rape is offensive. We all know that.
yes,
But
yes.
nevertheless, her rape jokes are better than everybody else's. So.
That's what you've told me. I'm going to take your word for it. But it is the sort of thing that reminds us. I guess it was Mencken who said that you're not going to defend freedom of speech and not be hanging out with people who say outrageous, terrible things, because that's where freedom of speech is defended. If someone's saying, if it's the usual politicians mouthing words that have been poll tested that are going to be the most agreeable, you rarely have to fight to be able to say those words. It's the words that cause people to be angry that you said it and to argue you shouldn't say that, that sometimes people need to hear. And sometimes they don't need to hear it. It is true that in a free society, you're going to hear more stuff that you didn't really want to hear or need to hear. It is true in a free society, you're going to have to spend a couple more minutes in the aisle looking for what it is you want, because there's 8 different kinds of that, because some people aren't you and they want it a little different way. In a free society, you're going to get it that way. And so, choose. And I always think, look, I like to think that if places that spoke English weren't free and places that spoke something else were, and I'm kind of a single language person at the moment. I'm working on it. I can say a few things in other languages. I have to pick one anyway. But I would learn that language because I'd want to go be free. And so if you think that the governmental expertise in China is the best in the world, then learn the language, go there. I'm sure they'll let you in. Good luck. But it's that sort of thing.
You give us 2 directions we can go. On Tuesday, you wrote The Incumbency Fraud, and that's about Democratic Party and insiders fiddling with elections. And is that the one you want to go to next?
Yeah, let's go to that one because I think it's real important, and it's also because of how, and you put it, insiders fiddling with elections, which was an excellent way to put it, because this is put, and I've been in meetings with people on the left talking about election reform. I've been in meetings with people on the right talking about election reform. Some talking about election integrity, some talking about election suppression and democracy and so on. And look, people believe different things, but the truth is what is passing in Congress, what has passed in the House and is headed and hopefully will be stopped in the Senate, which is H.R. 1, is a monstrosity. It is a terrible bill designed to help Democrats win elections and hurt Republicans' chances to win elections. And I can assure you that any bill in a state legislature, just look at the party label of who introduced it, and that's who's going to be helped by whether it passes or not. Now, it doesn't mean that everything the Democrats put in H.R. 1 is bad. And it doesn't mean that everything that's being pushed in state legislatures by Republicans is bad. Some of them are good changes. The difference is good for whom? And we know if we're not part of the discussion, if the public is just reading this like spectators, oh, the blue team did this, oh, the red team did that, we're screwed. Because the blue team stinks and the red team stinks, and both of them will cheat and destroy our elections if it helps them. So we have to be engaged. And I say that because the response to this from a number of different people was, some of it was surprise that, why would you be for not so much early voting? And what we're talking about is, which piece was the incumbency fraud. And basically it was, people talking about we need as much early voting as possible. There's nothing that does to create fraud. It was actually a Democratic Democratic Party attorney saying that, and he's right. There's nothing per se that increases fraud if you have more early voting. Now, you could argue there's more time for fraud, but I flipped all of that because the truth is there are frauds and there are frauds. And I wanted people to see the incumbency fraud. See, it's going to be easier for voters if we vote whenever we feel like it. Give us a year. And then maybe drive us in a Rolls Royce to the polls. That'd be the best way for us. But the Rolls Royce could be expensive. It could distort the economy, during those months as the Rolls Royce sales just zoomed. And frankly, all that time means that candidates have to campaign. And you might say, well, the campaigns are too long, short, and well, you can't dictate when someone can speak. So the campaigns can be as long as people want them to be. But they don't really have to spend money until people are voting. If you have money, you're going to want to start your advertising. And of course, if you have tons of money, a lot of incumbents, a lot of major races, they're spending money a year out and longer in some cases. So look, they got plenty of money. They're playing the game all the way until election day. But for a lot of challengers, they are coming from behind. They don't have any money. They don't have a vote on whose name to put in for the 1.9 trillion that's going to be spent in some cockamamie bill. The incumbent does. And that's why the incumbent's getting checks all the time and is doing just fine. And so, of course, they're going to deal if they have to spend money in the last 2 weeks when there's early voting, and I think early voting should not go beyond 2 weeks, then they can spend that money, and they can spend money for the month before that. But a challenger who doesn't have money to spend the month before that or the month before that can target their resources when people are about to vote or are voting. And of course, we still have absentee vote. And I'm not really for all kinds of, you have to show this cause or that cause. I want integrity. I want some check to make sure that since you're getting the ease of absentee voting where you don't have to come in early, you can just mail it in. I want some real checks there. But I don't want really that you have to have a valid excuse. I'm sick. I'm going to be out of town. Because now all of a sudden people are thinking they got to make something up. And I think making stuff up between people and their government should stop, especially the government making stuff up. But even the people having to make stuff up, forget that. No excuse. You want to vote absentee, fine. But there's going to be a real process. And you have to request the ballot and so on. But the early voting, if you, like in Virginia, we voted for 6 weeks. That's a ton of money that you've got to be spending that whole time because people are going to vote right now today. And if you can do that into 2 weeks, it's and in the old days when you really didn't have any early voting and it was election day, it was easier for challengers because they were catching incumbents at the end. And in that same scenario today, they catch the incumbent at the end and they lose the election because the incumbent has already banked enough votes when they had the advertising edge and when they had the name ID edge way off the charts. And late in the campaign, as the challenger gets enough name ID and his message out enough, because it's a new message, it's not the same one for the last 20, 30 years, that's when the vote's going his way or her way. And at that point, they win, except if there's too much early vote and it didn't change fast enough. So it's a real issue, and it's the sort of thing that I think I'm going to do something here in the future. It's an important campaign finance issue. And it occurred to me in thinking about it and discussing it this week that there are three big issues for me that are critical for campaign finance reform. Now, in most ways of thinking, I don't like campaign finance reform because it's all been about writing all kinds of ridiculous rules and complicated formulas, and you have to say this on your ad and you have to do that, and it's about the government pushing around people who want to be involved in campaigns. And I know it probably feels different if you got a whole wing of your building where lawyers and accountants are dealing with the FEC. But for those of us who don't have that and still have to deal with the FEC, our current campaign finance system is horrible for us. Wonderful if you're a billionaire, but horrible for us. And considering the whole reason to have it is to stop the billionaire, something's rotten. But the three issues that would do more to fix the problem of money in politics without actually always decreasing the amount of money, but just creating a better playing field where money itself has less influence. Here's the three. No more than 2 weeks of early voting. Creates too much expense. Helps the incumbent. No. The other two are this. Term limits. Term limits is a tremendous factor on campaign finance because the most competitive races are the most competitive financial races, and these open seats that are happening because of term limits create a system in which someone can get into the game. They have the resources to do that. It isn't an incumbent just beating them down with a huge war chest. And that's a huge advantage campaign finance-wise. And the other issue is smaller districts. If we had districts that were, the average congressional district is 730,000 people, something like that. I mean, the price of admission, you can't hardly go door to door and hit all the houses. I think you need districts that are no more than 70,000, preferably 50,000 for Congress. And there's a lot of state legislatures that have those sorts of districts that are much bigger than that, closer to congressional districts. That is a huge problem. And think about it. I was talking to somebody in Maine this week. Their house is 8,000 constituents in a House district. New Hampshire next door, 3,000. I think Vermont's 5,000 or 6,000 in a House district. It means that you can't come in with big money. What are you going to do? You're going to come in with big money and you're going to smear, Sally, who, works down at the bank and who's running for state house? I don't think so. Everybody knows Sally. And if they don't like her, it's not going to help that you smear her. They'll probably start to like her more. But the fact is, if they like her, you're smearing her with some big ad campaign. I mean, when the districts are small and we actually have some relationship with our representative, and I realize that, it's not like they're going to come over for Sunday dinner every week. I'm just some relationship, not totally foreign. It makes a difference, and it greatly diminishes the power of money without passing any complicated rule that a bunch of lawyers and accountants have to deal with. So there you have it.
Doesn't early voting also sort of lock in partisanship? That is, party affiliation? Because it would seem like that before the end of an election, it would be largely sort of on partisan basis that somebody might vote, but might sock their vote in early. And therefore, if you don't like the ramped up partisanship and just the strange divide in America now, maybe early voting wouldn't be the way to solve that problem.
I think there is an aspect of that. I hadn't seen any study or anything like that, but I think there's some common sense. And I had a lot of people this last election tell me they had already voted, and I thought, well, gee whiz, one was in Arkansas, and I was involved in the campaign there, and we hadn't started advertising yet. Of course, we didn't have a lot of money um, because they had started voting. Um, but you wonder, well, have these people found out? I mean, a lot of times it takes time to get messages out there, and yeah, I do think it's a big problem. And it's not like, it's not one of these things that, if it's 10 days instead of 14, it makes all the difference in the world, or 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It's not as if the republic just dissolves into nothingness. But everything you add to that for the convenience of the voter, you've got to question, is this why? There's a lot of things for convenience. We could all be carried around all day, but our muscles would start to atrophy. And I think if we don't vote together in this last election, not only are we getting messages from different places that are not agreeing on the facts, but some of us are voting 6 weeks before others. I mean, that's a whole different set of facts. Could be. Let me jump then to a piece that I did for Thursday, which was the 7th anniversary of the beginning of the Sunflower Student Movement in Taiwan. And it was on March 18th, 2014. That students, they had a demonstration there, and I don't know security or what, but all of a sudden they climbed a fence and they were in the legislative yuan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's YUAN. But so they basically kind of shut down the parliament, and it was all over a trade pact with China. And of course, at that point, the KMT, which was basically the Chiang Kai-shek folks who came over from China in 1949 when they lost the Civil War, and KMT had run the country the whole time. And 40 years of it, of course, were martial law from basically 1947 to 1987 or 84. And anyway, there's been this flowering of democracy, but this event, which I was not aware of until I traveled to Taiwan a couple of years ago, I now look at as a really, really important event, in that Taiwan is so strategically located there. It is a big player economically in the world for an island of 24 million people. And China has wanted to grab it and control it, which is not, of course, if you look at the history, China has not always been in control of Taiwan. It's been split up for again and again. But they want to control Taiwan. And there was kind of this view that maybe they had awakened to the idea that, why are we trying to get militarily strong enough to take over Taiwan? We're economically strong enough. Why don't we just get in and buy up as much of Taiwan as we can and control as much of Taiwan as we can? And that's how not just students, but a number of people who were very concerned about China and this trade pact saw it, that this was a way for China to basically purchase Taiwan. And so the next thing you know, when they had negotiated it in secret, and they had said they were going to agree to certain hearings, but they basically passed the trade pact, the initial vote for it, in 30 seconds after it hit the floor. And so the public reacted, and the students reacted and held the chamber. And I see it as not only critical because of what it did for Taiwan. But of course, this was March and April. I think there was a big surprise that the public embraced the sunflower student movement so much in Taiwan, because Taiwan's a fairly socially conservative place. I'm not talking about politically, but more socially. They're not big protesters. They don't, not that there isn't graffiti here or there, but it's just not, you don't destroy stuff and then get lionized very much in Taiwan. And I see that in most of Asia. I think that's the way it is. Most of America, that's the way it is. But so that sent a message. That message, I think, was part of what helped spur on the umbrella movement in Hong Kong in 2014, which was in September to the end of the year. Lots of protests about democracy, about them having rights. And of course, then those protests have come back. And now you see the clampdown in Hong Kong. But in Taiwan in 2016, you see the Democratic Progressive Party, Chai Ing-wen, basically get elected president, much more pro-independence. They don't usually use that term so much, but, has been very anti-Beijing. And basically, one of the things that Hong Kong's protests have done is to solidify the island of Taiwan, and any idea that one China, two systems is anything but a delay in your execution is seen to be a fraud. So, they know that they could be next, and so I just look at this event and I think it helped wake up the whole world, because what's been going on in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, it's been going on for years. And it has taken a lot of time for people to wake up. And I think the Obama-Biden administration years ago, completely asleep at the switch. And I have to say that so far, Biden has been very, very wary of China and very tough on China. And that's not accidental. That's because the American public has become more anti-China. And not, I mean, obviously the virus has a huge part to play in our feelings about China. I should say in our feelings about China, because it has no part to play in my feelings about China. I saw China and continue to see China as the number one threat to human decency and dignity and freedom and everything good in the world. And I don't say that believing that the United States is a shining city on the hill that's always done everything wonderful, because we haven't. And we're a threat sometimes because we do bad stuff sometimes. We, not being you and me and anybody listening for the most part, but these idiots that claim to represent us. So, and the people they empower to do our business. So the coronavirus didn't change my attitude toward China one iota. In fact, if you had my attitude toward China before the pandemic, you're not at all surprised that China hides all the evidence, destroys the evidence, lies about it. People are just flying out of China to the rest of the world, and they know things are going on, and they are not only not telling us, they're lying about it. And of course, it's not just, it's top down a lot. And it's the top that's talking to the rest of the world or not talking to the rest of the world. But because it is an unfree society, people are scared to talk bottom up too. So it's a real problem. And I want to say damn media, but I don't usually say words like damn and other four-letter words. The different media representations of what a wonderful job China has done on this, when of course they don't have any clue how many people have actually died in China. It's very, very difficult to cover these things, and China lies all the time. And I don't mean everyone in China. I mean the CCP. I mean the Chinazis, not the good people of China. So anyway, but they've pretended that somehow China has done such a wonderful job. And granted, the US has not done such a wonderful job, except that at least there's been some laboratories of democracy because it wasn't all federally mandated. But other free societies have. Taiwan, for instance. Something I wrote, I guess last August, I think it was, that someone I was discussing this with, I sent them that piece. It's called Friends and Enemies. And it was about Taiwan and China, but it wasn't talking so much about they're our friends, they're our enemies, but just how they behaved. And China lied to us and tricked us and then blamed us and did everything that a rotten neighbor would do. And Taiwan, on their own did all kinds of things, alerted other people to it, gave materials out, and why? Well, it wasn't because some great leader in Taiwan did a wonderful thing. It's because the whole society communicates. They're free. They're allowed to talk. They're allowed to say what they think. And not that, look, Taiwan's not a perfect society. The United States is not a perfect society. None of the European countries are perfect societies. That's not in the cards. But the difference between having that basic sense that I can say something, that we're all in this together, that the person who just got into the elevator is not an enemy, but probably a friend. I've never seen him before. But if they had, some problem, I would point it out as hey, your money's fallen out of your pocket. In other words, it's that connectiveness to society. And, if people believe that a top-down society where orders are sent from the top to do everything, where there is no freedom and no democracy, is going to create a better outcome, please go in peace to those societies in all due haste.
We didn't mention, I don't think, and of course I always forget certain things we say as we go through these pieces of each week, but I don't think we mentioned the title. It's First Class Freedom Fighting.
First Class Freedom Fighters.
Fighting, March 18th. We're getting beyond an hour now. We're approaching it anyway.
And people can go read left-winged Wikipedia, but the bad news is that Wikipedia has become much more left-wing and has kind of developed standards like Facebook and Twitter, which are no standards of any kind at all. But the good news is that there are beginning to be alternatives. And not, I say beginning, what is it? Conservatopia is... Conservapedia has been out there since 2006, and other places are out there as well.
And Britannica has been out there for a long time.
But I think that we need alternatives. We need competition on the internet, and real competition, because we live in a world that is easier to be tricked, easier to be ignorant of the truth than I think any time in the last 500 years or something. I mean, it's just, and the ability of big government to hit the kill switch on our communication is outrageous. The ability of government to find out what our communication is, supposedly they're not doing that anymore. Supposedly, we live in such consequential times, and I think about it as I get older that I would like to leave with the world in better shape than it's in right now. It's really a little scary.
This has been This Week of Common Sense with Paul Jacob. On behalf of Paul, I thank you for tuning in, and remember, always go to the website, thisiscommonsense.org, and you can find everything Paul does there, or nearly everything. Everything you need to know.